start by recollecting all the great acharyas from the time of the Buddha himself, and the great disciples of the Buddha, down to the present, to Ajahn Mun, Ajahn Chah, and the disciples of Ajahn Chah, Ajahn Sumedho, Ajahn Pasano, the Kruba Ajahns who are our teachers. So nice to start by recollecting them, paying homage to them, to all the great teachers, that we are the recipients of their teachings. And one of my own personal recollections that have come up is like when I was 7 vasas, when I had been a bhikkhu for 7 years, I felt like I was really senior. But now that I've been a bhikkhu for 17 years, I feel like I'm really junior. I think that's how it is as the practice develops. It's like when I was 7 vasas, that was about the time I was thinking, oh, if I could be an abbot someday, I could build the perfect monastery. And now I feel like, why did they make me an abbot? I'm just some guy. But maybe it'll have some sort of benefit somehow, eventually. One of the qualities of Dhamma that was coming up for me, I guess, during the meditation was there's all these different epithets that the Buddha uses to describe the Dhamma, and one of them is the very hard to see. The Dhamma is the very hard to see. And I think like a sort of dynamic that I see coming up with people during these kind of sensitive historical times is a sense of like the problem is out there, the problem is outside, but that's an illusion. It's actually coming from the inside. It's all here. It's all in the heart, but it's very hard to see. It's very hard to see. So it's understandable that it's going to seem like the problems are outside. Yeah. It's also, another epithet for the Dhamma is the amazing, the wonderful. Those are two ways the Buddha refers to it. Yeah. So just coming back to turning the light inward, seeing how are things playing out in the heart, and what's that apparatus in the heart that makes things seem like they're coming at us or impinging on us from the outside. It's kind of like what Luang Por Ban said, when you see the very hard to see, when you see the Dhamma, you see the very hard to see, then it's things change. So at first it was like when the defilements are in control, or when the deep-seated delusion and ignorance is in control of the heart, which it is for all of us unless we reach the Dhamma, then everything is like an impingement. Everything external is an impingement on the heart. But when the heart turns over and it is in the Dhamma, it becomes the Dhamma, then everything is Dhamma. Everything is teaching us. Everything is exactly, absolutely, perfectly, unbelievably how it should be in every moment. Doesn't mean to say we don't react to things or do our best to make good decisions in different situations, but it's an interesting contemplation. And also we come back to like kindness, compassion, all of these qualities the Buddha talked about, which are helpful. And also like the Dhammapada quote, which is probably the most quoted Dhammapada quote, but probably the least understood, which is that hatred never ceases through hatred. Only through love does hatred cease, or only through metta, through goodwill, does hatred cease. One of the most famous quotes in the Dhammapada, but probably one of the hardest to put into practice. Because what the heart is telling us normally is through hating hatred, will cease. We'll get hatred to stop through hating hatred or through attacking and killing hatred. But that it's actually so simple. It's actually so clearly simple, but it's so hard. It's so hard to practice. It's so hard to put into practice. So and so not to be too hard on ourselves. It takes this kind of thing can take a lifetimes to develop. Yeah. So sometimes it's helpful to find ways to not make it as heavy. Sometimes things can get really heavy, and even little things can get heavy. I've talked in previous Dhamma talks about how bread breakfast can get very heavy, and one can look forward to it and be disappointed in various ways because of the expectations. But so if things start to get heavy, I like to think of like I don't know why this is, but there was a Disney character that was coming up in my mind today, and I thought I'm gonna try to bring that up in the talk. And this character is Goofy. He's not really focused on much or talked about much, and he's probably, in my mind, my memory anyway, he's probably one of the most profound Disney characters. And he's actually so profound that you almost can't even talk about him. But he's actually very deep, and he's kind of like, you don't even know what he is, actually. Like, nobody really knows what kind of animal he is. Is he a dog, or is he a donkey, or what is he? You don't really know. And but he's kind of this iconic character, and he's kind of laughing all the time, and kind of, even if there's nothing really happening, he's kind of there, just being goofy. And but at times, somebody like another character would have like a difficulty, and Goofy would be the one to be like, hey, life is like that. Life is painful. Life is suffering. And Goofy would be the one to kind of be his friend. And he's also someone who never judges anybody. So he sort of like, he's like kind to everybody. Nobody thinks Goofy's going to be like upset with them. I think Donald Duck is more the one that gets upset with people, and Goofy is the one that's kind of like, it's almost like he's just kind of laughing, just trying to make people feel better. So I was thinking, like, we kind of have to be like that, like non-judgmental friendliness, in order to kind of make life more bearable, make situations more bearable. And one thing that's also pretty amazing as time goes on, the long-term lay residents at Abhayagiri have been continuing to look after us. So that's been quite wonderful. And just coming back to what's inside, what's very hard to see, and sometimes we might have like our pet problem or the thing which is like the biggest issue for us, whether it's anger or fear or greed, we might, or confusion, or pride or whatever. We might have like what we consider the biggest issue for us. And I think it might be useful actually as like almost like a guided meditation, just to do one of these thought experiments where we ask ourselves like, what's the biggest kind of issue or defilement for me? We can ask ourselves this. What do we consider to be our one of our like shortcomings, perhaps? We might. Or some way that we keep slipping up, that we keep falling down, or we keep kind of regretting that we do it, or it's just so painful, but we keep doing it. So we can ask ourselves that. And then we can ask ourselves, like, do I want to be free of that? Do I want to be free of that thing? Do I want to be free of greed? Do I want to be free of fear? Do I want to be free of anger? And the answer to that question can be quite interesting, because sometimes, like, although we may have some way that we keep making a mistake or keep suffering over something, then there may be a sense of identification with it. So I'm an angry person, or I'm a greedy person, I'm a fearful person, I'm an anxious person, I'm afraid of whatever, afraid of being criticized, afraid of being harmed. I am that kind of person. So our Ajahns have talked about this a lot. This is something Ajahn Amaro used to talk about here at Abhayagiri. Yeah. Being identified with certain things which are making us suffer, but because of the identification, then being unable to let it go. Because although it's painful, at least it's familiar, at least it's known. So there's this desire to know, to be with the known, and that's also part and parcel of identification, investment in something. So this desire to know what's going to happen, that's very strong. So it's kind of like with the Buddha's teachings, the faith needs to be quite strong in the teaching, and if the faith isn't strong enough, then we won't have enough trust in the Dhamma teaching of the Buddha and the Kruba Ajahns. We won't have enough trust to actually put it into practice. it might be interesting, it might sound good, but the faith won't be quite at a level where we actually put it into practice. So when the Kruba Ajahns are saying, do you want to be free of that? Do you want to be free of fear? Then you have to let go of this and this and this. Let go of the identification, let go of the attachment, let go of the clinging to me as somebody who is this way, or I am this person. Or it might be like towards somebody else, they are always this way. They always were this way and they always will be that way. So there's a non-seeing of anicca, there's a non-seeing of impermanence there. If the mind is speaking in terms of finalities, or like if the mind is using, if our thoughts are using words like always or never, then it's not seeing impermanence, it's not seeing anicca. So there's these little signposts, these little ways that we can trace it back. Oh yeah, okay. That shows that deep in the heart somewhere, I don't believe all things are impermanent, unsatisfactory, not self. So the three characteristics aren't seen. So we can have these little like pointers, like what's happening in our thought processes, and trace it back and say, oh, that's where there's a lack of insight. That's where the delusion is occurring. Always, never. Kama, that kama is linked to this contemplation as well. Learning how to see like how to say, externalizing things, and what we call turning the light around, coming back in. So like, for example, if we're afraid of losing something, say as another thought experiment, we're afraid of losing something. If we were to turn the light around, we'd say, well, what about my sense of wanting or sense of ownership? If there's a fear of losing something, then the sense of ownership is to blame. Or fear of like being harmed. Just to look inward, turn the light around, thoughts of harming. The karmic result of thoughts of harming is fear of harm. And so that's taken out as a contemplation. That's not being said as an absolute truth, but it's like, oh, is that the case? Questioning, is that actually the case? Or you can extend it to, this other person is this way. Turn the light around. Do I have that quality in myself? And am I saying somebody else is that way in order to not have to look at that quality in myself? Very hard to see. Insecurity, I know what that one's like from experience. Yeah. Sense of like wanting to be liked and not wanting to be disliked. It's like, oh, turn the light around. The sense of like me being impinged upon, or the sense of self, the Sakkaya Ditthi, the personality view, perhaps is the culprit. So this can also lead into like a contemplation of the elements. We were talking about that at tea time. So like the Buddha telling Rahula to meditate like the earth. The earth receives clean things and dirty things, and it's just the earth. It's unaffected by those things. So the mind receives praise and criticism, but to remain unaffected by those things by being still and stable and powerful, like the earth. Or like that sense of stability, the earth quality as a contemplation is like a sense of stability. So making the mind like the earth is bringing the mind to a state of safety and stability, unshakability. And this links together again with Sakkaya Ditthi, because when with anatta, with not self, when we hear not self as a contemplation, it's easy to think like there's a sense of like everything is floating around or something like that, or like shaky. But with anatta, with not self, it's actually, it would be unbelievable stability. Is a sign that one is starting to see anatta. So that sense of being like a pillar, like a sense of strong stability. The Buddha uses analogy when because our experience, we're always bringing it back to our experience. There's like normally there's like these different animals tied together with ropes, and the strongest animal will pull all the other animals in that direction. So it's like the eye, ear, nose, tongue, and body. They're all tied together by ropes, and whatever is the strongest pull, whether it's the eye or the ear or tongue or whatever, then it's going to pull the other sense bases in that direction. But then when there's a pillar sunk deep in the ground, and then all these 5 different animals are tied to this pillar, no matter how hard they pull, none of them pulls the other ones anywhere, because they're all tied to this pillar. So it's like the pillar of sati, the pillar of mindfulness. And mindfulness is just turning the light around, just seeing things clearly. Very hard to see. Yeah, so unbelievably hard to see and to acknowledge. But it's our duty as practitioners to learn how to do this. Another way you can think about the elements for people who have like a Western scientific mindset, there is a Western scientific way to contemplate the elements as well. And so in the Satipatthana Sutta, the Buddha talks about the body just being composed of earth, water, fire, air, or wind. Sometimes it's known as wind instead of just air. And seeing that there's these different qualities of these elements, and these are the Mahabhuta. These are the great properties, the four great properties, which comprise both our body, but also the external world. And we start to see these things as like a heavy, and as a burden. And that leads to a cooling of mind, which we call like nibbida, world weariness, and dispassion. But there is another way to think about them, which is just things, all elements, say the periodic table of elements. All things exist in one of three states. So they exist as earth element or solid. They exist in a solid state, or they exist in a water element or a liquid state. They exist in an air element or a gas state. And fire is the regulator, or the temperature. It regulates whether it's in a solid, liquid, or gas state. Both temperature and pressure. And so that's another way to think of these things, that you could see like fire element as the regulator. It regulates digestion, it regulates our body temperature. Our body can only be alive if the fire element is just within a very small window of degrees. It drops even slightly too low and we can't survive, and it goes a little bit too high, we can't survive. I remember the story of Luangpur Pasano being in Thailand with scrub typhus, but it was not diagnosed very quickly, and his fever, he was in the hospital, and his fever went up and up and up, and went up to 106, I believe. And once your fever gets to like 107 or 108, then it can be fatal. And his fever was just sort of hovering there, really, really high fever for a long time. And just that the power of the fire element, and I think he said he felt like his brain was going to be like a cooked egg, and he was starting to get afraid of not whether he was going to survive, but he was starting to get afraid that he would survive, and that what would happen, it would be like brain dead or something. But luckily he wasn't. But then they gave him the right medicine, and then the fever was able to go down. So that's like fire element, and fire element is also the way the digestion. If the fire goes out in terms of the digestion, we had a monk here that happened to him, a Venerable Dhammadaso, a very good monk in the early days of Abhayagiri, and the fire went out on his digestion, and he couldn't consume anything that couldn't pass directly into the intestines. So the cooks had the job of making 5 or 6 bowls of mush for him each day, different types of mush. And it had to be like really mushy mush. It had to be extremely pureed, and couldn't have any bits in it. I think he had potato mush and carrot mush and a few other types of mush. And it was very bland and very boring. And sometimes it's like, couldn't stand it anymore. It's like, how can you can only eat tasteless mush for so long before you have to try something, even if it's going to kill you or make you be in extreme pain. So, just one bite of fish, please. And then it would just be days of pain. So that's like some contemplation of fire element. Wind is like that's like the breath. So that's the downgoing wind, the upgoing wind, without which we can't stay alive. So that's and all of these element contemplations are also linked with the other very important practice of death contemplation, because you think of like the breath stops for just a short period of time and we can't survive anymore. So that's like wind element. Wind element has to work with fire element. Water element is the blood coursing through our body, and then the earth element being the everything that's solid, the bones, things that hold us upright. There's also consciousness element and space element. Consciousness element is very interesting because that's the vijnana dhatu. That's the element of like experience, or that which allows us to know things and to experience things. And it's divided. Vit jnana. It's not just jnana. It's vit jnana. It's divided knowing. So it's divided out the eye. It's divided out the ear. Divided out the nose, divided out the tongue, divided out the body, and divided out the mind as the sixth, and mind objects, thoughts, perceptions. So it's knowing. It's one type of knowing, but it's divided. So that's an element that the Buddha talks about. And in Thai, there's kind of a joke, like they call it ghost. Like a ghost is vijnan. It's vijnan. And so like you have like ghost, and then the Kru Bajans would make jokes like somebody would say like, I think there was like a ghost in the monastery, Ajahn. And he said, yes, there is a ghost here right now. And he'd say like, it's inside, it's in there. That's your vijnan. So we all have our little, we have a ghost. We all have a ghost inside of us. Or like, there's this, it's kind of a little bit off topic, but there's this story of Ajahn Mahabua on Tudong with another, an Ajahn who was senior to him. I'm not sure who it was. And Ajahn Mahabua had to relieve himself, so he went over to a bush and he said, tell me if somebody's coming. And then he like squatted down, and the other monk said, there's somebody here. And he said, where? And he was pointing at Ajahn Mahabua, there's somebody there. And so these are the kind of jokes the Kru Bajans play on each other. But the deeper meaning being there's still somebody there. There's still, you're still somebody. Very hard to see. These are a few ramblings. I was trying to think, some things to contemplate, or just to keep the mind with Dhamma. Just things like faith and turning the light inwards, and kindness, lightness, not being judging of oneself and others. You could maybe metta could be translated as non-judgmental friendliness. And just finding ways to make things sustainable, and kind of like Goofy, the Disney character. Just like, he's going to be the one who's kind of laughing and kind of joking a lot, but that's going to be the one who is kind of like, hey, it's okay. He's not judging you. It's going to be like, he's the one who's going to be like, yeah, life is like that. Life is difficult. Life is painful. And living life, a large part of living life is learning about how to deal with pain, the external and internal pain, dukkha. That's a large part of our life. That is our life, actually. That is what life is. It's like if somebody ever was to ever say, I've never suffered before, I'd just maybe go and talk to their friends and relations. Oh yeah. Everybody suffers. Everybody has pain. It's not just us. Absolutely everybody. Even devas have pain. It's like when they have to pass away. They apparently, according to the Devic lore, they suffer immensely when they have to pass away, when they have to leave their state. So not just every person has pain, but every being has pain, has to deal with that. Yeah, fear, pain. So to kind of find ways, okay, well, let's get through this, make it sustainable. So I'll offer that, I guess, for reflection this evening.